that handle the migration of domestic workers. They should also put in place steep penalties for breaking the rules. Number 6, domestic workers should undergo training prior to their departure. But first, the government should train the trainers, and these trainers must have had previous working experience from the Gulf. So a lot of the issues that we face here are really not about the employers here, but about the government policies. It has everything to do with the government, the agencies that handle the migration, and to some extent, the workers themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Halai, for that elaborate explanation on quite a number of recommendations that the government should take in place to ensure that the rights of migrant workers, and specifically women migrant workers, are realized in the Gulf Cooperation. But to just take you back, because we were addressing the question of the policy, since we were not able to see whether mainstreaming of the Kenyan diaspora in national development processes has been realized, I think from your comment on the increase, increase in GDP and the contribution through remittances of various migrant workers in the Gulf, that points to just the question of how government has made efforts to mainstream the Kenyan diaspora into development processes. And I think Kenya Diaspora Alliance has been very vibrant in organizing various conferences around how to marshal the Kenyan diaspora towards economic development through remittances. I think the theme across the board I have seen for various conferences that have been held relate to remittances. But the question that I would pose is whether in these conferences there is a question that touches on the social aspect of migrant workers, which is going to come much later. Perhaps to just take a look also at the policy, the diaspora policy, it empowers, it seeks to empower Kenyans abroad to effectively contribute to the development of the country by enhancing the capacity of to offer consular services. In your recommendations, I think I haven't had aspects of consular services abroad. Perhaps maybe you can shed some more light on how effective consular services are in the diaspora.
If I might, sorry to jump in there, Halai, I think one of the things that Halai said a bit earlier was that she wasn't at liberty to disclose what arrangements she's made with the embassy, and obviously it's the embassy that offers us consular services. But I can say a few things since I'm no longer in Saudi, and therefore I can give you a bit of a view from my end of how that works. In my opinion, consular services offered by Kenyan embassies are very highly individualized. And what I mean by that is that a lot depends on who the ambassador is at the time, and therefore who the staff are. And I'll give you an example from Saudi Arabia. For a long time, the ambassadors that Kenya sent to Saudi Arabia to represent Kenyans' interests tended to be Muslims, either from the coast of Kenya or from northeastern province. Now, what would happen is that the Kenyans who went to the Gulf to work in Saudi Arabia typically were not really Muslims. Most of them were Christians, and they were usually from upcountry. Whenever there was a dispute between a Saudi Arab Muslim employer and an African Christian Kenyan employee, the ambassador and his staff, who tended to be from the coast or from northeastern province, would generally believe the Muslim over the Christian. This is a theme that came up over and over again when I was in Saudi Arabia and when I was leading the Kenyan society in Saudi Arabia. It was that there wasn't effective advocacy from the Kenyan embassy for Kenyans. And even when you found one or two attaches that were willing to sort of stand up for the Kenyan, the ambassador or a deputy ambassador or somebody else would overrule them, because the relationship between Kenya and Saudi Arabia was to them far more important than the welfare of one housemaid or one driver or one this or one that. And so even though the embassies have the capacity to offer better consular services, the will to offer those services is not institutionalized. You cannot just walk into any Kenyan embassy anywhere in the world, let alone Saudi Arabia, and expect to receive the same level of service that you can receive, actually, bizarrely, from the British High Commission. So a really good example. In 2013, there was a number of protests beginning 2011 in the Middle East, the Arab Spring. And so there was a lot of trouble in Saudi Arabia, particularly in the western city of Jeddah. And what Saudi Arabia did was that they realized this was an opportunity for them to get rid of some of the people they did not want in the country. And so they began deporting large numbers of Africans and other people that they saw as undesirables. Now, when Kenyans went to the Kenyan embassy for help, they wouldn't be helped. They would be turned away at the gate. Actually, the Kenyan security staff at the diplomatic quarter in Riyadh were instructed to turn Kenyans away. What Kenyans did was that they went to the British embassy in Riyadh, and the British embassy forced the Kenyan embassy to actually help these people. And so you get an idea of the dynamics that play out in the diplomatic world. The capacity to offer the services is there, the will, and just the sheer willingness and the sort of duty of care that our ambassadors and our diplomats should have does not exist. And so it's one thing to provide personnel, it's one thing to provide room and resources and everything else, but it's another to have people who are actually willing to go out of the way to help. And that is the reason why we formed the Kenyan Society in Saudi Arabia as a group of Kenyans, because we were getting no help whatsoever from the embassy at the time.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Peter Wanyonyi, for that very insightful discussion around how the consular services have been operating abroad. Perhaps before we move to the next question, I would like also to hear the perspective from Lebanon, which can be addressed by Claire. How responsive do you think the consular services in Lebanon have been for the migrant workers who have reported violations to the Victims Advocates International offices?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that, and I'm going to answer in much the same way as Peter. The political will is not there, and I think, well, just to give you a bit of a background of what the situation in Lebanon, it occurred throughout 2020, and all the things I was talking about before, the economic crash, COVID, a lot of Kenyan migrant domestic workers were finding themselves on the street with no ability to return home. And they, what I hadn't realized, a group approached me, and they were receiving, first of all, they were receiving no help from the consul. But second of all, what I hadn't really realized is because women here are not able to have their own bank accounts, often what they will do is they will store their money with the consul and just they'll send some of it home, and the savings that they're making, they'll have it at the consul's office. And so they were going to the consul and asking to access some of that.
Sorry, Claire, I think we have lost you a bit.
I think she broke up a bit, but
yes.
Just to emphasize the point she was making, this is a very familiar tale in the Middle East. So it's not very easy for a woman, let alone an African woman, to go to a bank in Saudi Arabia, for example, and open an account. They've got to have a male sponsor who's willing to sign off on that account. Now, what that means is that it places the financial security of the woman in this employer. And so when a girl goes to the Middle East, it's potluck, okay? If she is lucky and she finds a good employer, then she'll do okay. But if she finds someone who is abusive or exploitative, he can even refuse to pay her salary, or he could be saying, "I have sent your money abroad to your parents and to whomever," but he hasn't. He hasn't got the power to compel him to prove that or to show it. Now, Khalai mentioned the case of the Philippines and Nepal and Indonesia, and one of the things that the Philippine embassy does in Saudi, which is very admirable, is that they actually appoint roving ambassadors to literally go around and check on these girls, not wait for them to come to the embassy. They have somebody whose job, in agreement with the Saudi government, this person's job is to literally drive around and check on all the girls who are working in that particular area, and each of them has a cell, like 10 houses or 20 houses or whatever. And they speak to the girl and they make sure that she is okay. Kenya does not have any such arrangement. And so when our people go there, when they're exploited, they literally have no one to turn to unless they find someone who is, benevolent enough to give them help. Sorry, Claire, I think you broke off, and that's why I
did. Sorry. Thank you for filling in. I'm not sure where I broke off, but the situation for Kenyans trying to get help at the embassy was that they were, or at the consul, sorry, was that they were going to the consul, they were asking for their money, which they had stored at the consul so that they could use it to try and get themselves out of this situation. They were asking for help in being able to return back to Kenya. And they were getting, not only were they getting refused all of that by the consul here, but there were numerous allegations of people being sexually harassed and physically assaulted when they were making those requests. The consul here is a Lebanese national, and the allegations were made against him and his assistant. They're both Lebanese. It's not a full embassy that's here. The embassy is in Kuwait. And so I think one of the problems is, with the lack of will, there's not a lot of sympathy, there's not a lot of connection between the consul staff and the Kenyans that are trying to access services, because these, the people that work there, they do work for the Kenyan government, but I don't think having met them that they feel like they work for the Kenyan government, and they certainly don't feel like they're there to be helping the Kenyans that come to them for assistance. The women who were at this point camping outside the consul, kind of begging for them for help, that did approach the embassy in Kuwait, where people who are actually Kenyan work, and no help was really forthcoming from there either. So I think there's kind of multiple layers of disengagement, and some of it stems from the fact that people don't feel an affinity. They're not Kenyan, so that it's not their nationals that they're helping. But there's also kind of a disengagement from the embassy that oversees it as well, and a lack of accountability, so that when these issues did come out, they were reported in CNN, and we also wrote to the Kenyan embassy and others trying to address it. There just wasn't enough mechanisms to be able to make complaints and to ensure that they were followed up on. So there's a real problem in terms of Kenyans actually being able to access services here.
Can I just say something about what happened here during the pandemic? We have a new ambassador. This is his third year, okay? Immediately the pandemic started, he was able to distribute food amongst the Kenyan workers who are not at work. And he did that for several months. He was able to take care of them. And in that way ensured that they were safe. They had food to eat. They had roofs over there, they had a place to sleep. So that is very different from what Claire is talking about, and also a little bit different from what Peter experienced previously. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that in. We've seen a lot of changes. We are actually receiving a lot of help from the current embassy. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you very much, Halai, and thank you very much, Claire. I just wanted to ask Claire a follow-up question in regards to a rescue of women in distress. Are there any mechanism that exists in terms of rescuing women in distress?
Rescuing the women that are in distress. The women really had to take this matter into their own hands and try and find creative ways to bringing to having these grievances be addressed, because the Lebanese courts are not really available to them, particularly after once they no longer have a valid contract. If they are on a valid contract, technically they can access the Lebanese courts, but there's a huge amount of research done that indicates that the system is so biased against them that they basically never win. Once they don't have a contract anymore, which is the case for once they're camping outside in front of the consul, they no longer have a contract. Those women cannot access the courts. So the Lebanese system isn't there. In terms of what's available in the Kenyan system, the only people that you can complain to is the same people that they're constantly dealing with. It's the consul and his assistant. So if their grievance is with them, then there isn't an obvious way for them to kind of tell anybody or alert anybody that they are distressed, as you say, and trapped. they, as I said, they did write to the embassy. They really took that matter into their own hands. They wrote the letter. They found a way to get it to Kuwait, which wasn't really, that nothing happened in response to that. And eventually they petitioned General Security, which is like the Lebanese security body that's in charge of immigration here. And they finally helped them with some travel documentation that would at least just get them out of the country, so then that they could go back home. So there wasn't an official mechanism that they could use or go through, but they kind of just knocked on everybody's door until finally they found a way to get some help in leaving the country. And they also did talk to the media because, there was this case in CNN that was quite high profile. So they really kind of just tried everything until eventually somebody paid attention. But it wasn't a formal mechanism as such, and that's problematic.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, for that elaborate explanation on whether there are formal mechanisms for just getting ladies who are in distress to help. Back to Halai, because she mentioned something, a different approach in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps she has mentioned there's a new ambassador who has made efforts to assist Kenyans in distress in Saudi Arabia, and I commend the ambassador for the efforts that he has made towards just trying to help those who are in distress. But perhaps to just expound on these efforts, because where we speak about just donation or giving out food, that may not really, it may assist temporarily, but in the long term, where there are concerns about contracts not being, the migrant workers not being, women migrant workers not being issued with contracts, not being paid their dues, not being allowed to go to seek for medical assistance when they fall ill. These are critical issues that touch on their livelihoods of people. So beyond the food, and we commend him for that effort, what has help have, or tangible help have the women migrant workers received in Saudi Arabia?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I have not been released to give that information. I'm not at liberty to discuss that right now.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. But from your experience, have you seen any tangible efforts that have come towards supporting the women migrant workers to just get a lasting solution to the problems that they face?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you very much. I invite our participants to engage us through the chat box. You can ask any questions, which we'll share with our panelists for response. And then there's another question I'd like to put to Peter. Peter, recently, the court boss, Francis Atwoli, mentioned that going to the Gulf is like slavery. And if you look at the comments made by Halai about the caliber of workers who should go to the Gulf, and then in a response, the Labour CS Cabinet Secretary Simon Chelugui also said that the government is working to have bilateral agreements with these Gulf countries. Does it mean that these agreements have never been in existence, or what's happening?
So the first time we heard about bilateral agreements between Kenya and Gulf countries was when the then Vice President Kalonzo Musyoka visited Saudi Arabia. I think from memory, it was probably about 2006 or so. And at the time, the plan was that there would be an agreement of the sorts that the Philippines and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so on have, which, as Halai said earlier, they delineate the rights of a worker, a foreign worker, and they also delineate the responsibilities of the employer. And they give the embassy certain rights as far as that worker is concerned. Chief among them is the ability to see this worker at least once a month or speak to them on the phone verifiably at least once a month. There's never been such a bilateral agreement. And the reason for that is obvious. The relationship between Kenya and Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf countries is quite lopsided. Economically, they are very powerful. they can do without us. Effectively, they can do without us, because all over Africa, whether it's Ethiopia or Eritrea or Uganda or Tanzania, there are countries that are in dire economic straits whose people are trying to get out and go to the Gulf. And so when Kenya's government goes to negotiate with these Gulf countries, it's negotiating from a point of weakness. If they say, sorry, we just cannot accept that, there isn't much that the Kenyan government can do.
Oh, okay. We lost you a bit. Perhaps you can repeat on the question of having bilateral agreements.
Yes, I was just saying that we have had previous instances where we tried to have those bilateral agreements, and there have been ministerial delegations from Kenya that went to the Gulf countries, but nothing came of them because I think Kenya was largely negotiating from a point of weakness, because Kenya needs the Gulf does not need Kenya. And therefore, if you are to address these issues, although it has to be at government level, there are things that need to happen within the Kenyan structure itself, economically, before you can actually address this. It is all well and good for us to say, okay, government must go there and must enforce this, but Kenya's government is diplomatically quite weak in the Middle East. I'm glad to hear that the new ambassador, Ambassador Ondego, has done a lot of things in Saudi Arabia. He's changed a few things, and that's fantastic. But as I said earlier, this approach is individualized. If you have a good ambassador, these good things happen. But if you get an ambassador who is not as driven, because of the lack of institutional approaches to handling these issues, then you just go back to square zero. And this is what really needs to be looked at.
So there's need to institutionalize the services that are being offered in various consular offices, absolutely, as well as embassies, for there to be sustainability and assurance of the protection of the rights of all workers, migrant workers, but in this context, we are focusing on the women migrant workers. Thank you very much for that very insightful thought. I think I will now allow my colleague Moses to ask the next question.
Okay, my question now goes to Claire, and I come back to the issue of legal and policy framework that safeguards Kenyans in the diaspora, especially in the context of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. I know that Peter has mentioned something, but as a person who normally deals with victims, I'd like to hear your comment in terms of legal and policy framework that safeguard Kenyans in the diaspora, especially women.
Yeah. So I think there's the policy framework that exists, and then there's a policy framework that doesn't exist, and it would be better if there was more in place. But there is already like international treaties that Kenya has signed, and Kenya's own constitution, which should offer some protection to migrant domestic workers. Even so, Kenyans that are outside of Kenya, they do have duties owed to them still by the Kenyan government, and consul officials in a certain country will owe certain obligations to their own citizens within the country. So, just things that have been signed, like CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which just has general provisions about how women should be treated by the government. And there has been interpretations of CEDAW by the CEDAW committee, which go into specific detail about how migrant domestic worker women should be treated. So if you look at the international like the treaties that Kenya has signed, there's kind of enough obligations there to be able to see that at the moment they're not quite fulfilling them, and that migrant domestic workers, Kenyan migrant domestic workers abroad, do have these rights in these other countries that aren't currently being fulfilled. The Kenyan constitution as well has extraterritorial effects. So because it's the Kenyan government operating in these other countries towards Kenyan citizens, they should also be implementing their constitutional obligations. And that's not happening either. So, well, at least, in my experience, and I understand that it's different in different countries, but certainly it was the case that for the Kenyans in Lebanon, those constitutional and international obligations on Kenya's part were not being implemented within Lebanon. And that is something that technically should be able to be adjudicated in Kenyan courts. I think that what would be good is if there was a bit more detail about how those international and constitutional obligations are supposed to play out for people in the diaspora. And I think that that could be achieved, first of all, by there's some ILO conventions on migrant domestic workers specifically that Kenya hasn't signed yet, which it would be good if they did. They don't impose a lot of new obligations, but they kind of provide the detail for existing obligations of what specifically Kenya is supposed to do. And I think a diaspora law or diaspora policy could achieve the same thing. You kind of have to dig deep to understand what the Kenyan government's obligations are to Kenyans that are abroad. The information is there, but you kind of have to dig through the case law to find it. I think a diaspora policy would kind of tie that all into the same place, and it would be a source that people could consult so they could be really clear on what their obligations are when they're abroad. And so I think, yeah, it's something that it's a gap and it's needed.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Back to, I think I would pose this question to, and just to continue with the conversation on legal and policy framework, to Halai, because the Kenyan government has ratified the ILO Convention number 143 of migrant workers and the Convention 97 on migration for employment. In addition, it has the East African Community Common Market Protocol, which of course deals with movements and so forth within the East African region. And recently, it has ratified the UN guiding principles on business and human rights by actually coming up with a national action plan on business and human rights, which I think is a step towards the realization of the rights of migrant workers, but a lot still needs to be done. My question to you is this: is this a positive future for Kenya in terms of protection of migrant workers' rights? And what is the implication now that we have ratified the UN the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and how migrant workers are going, the relationship between Kenya and the Gulf Cooperation is going to be in terms of the kind of bilateral agreements that it seeks to sign with the countries in the Gulf Cooperation?
Yes, I believe that is surely going to help a lot of these migrant workers, because now anytime someone comes for a job, they're not coming without a guideline. It has been set right there. And with that, you know, with that contract, that kind of contract, and with that kind of backing of the UN, they are least likely to be oppressed. They are least likely to face the kind of abuse that we have seen in the past, you know, because now it's out there for the world to see. So I do believe that's a step in the right direction.
That's a step. Okay, thank you very much. But to you, Peter, and just to conclude on the question of legal and policy framework, the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which ratifies the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, actually identifies agencies as part of the problem when we examine the question of migrant workers, and especially women who face exploitation in the process of securing employment opportunities in the Gulf. It has specifically made recommendations for strengthening the supervisory role of the National Employment Authority, as well as this has, of course, a direct impact on the Ministry of Labor, Social Security, and I would just like you to make your comments on this specific ratification and its impact on how the agencies are going to conduct their services.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sandra. And you're right. If you're going to address this issue, you're going to address it at both ends. So you have to address it in the Gulf, obviously, where these girls are going and where they're getting abused. But you also have to address the supply side, which is where they're coming from. And that is where the weakness is, because one of the problems we have in Kenya is that the agents, the recruitment agents, are not really policed. There is no licensing regime for them. The Ministry of Labor doesn't even know who they are. And anyone can be an agent, quite literally. You can set up an office today and you become an agent and you get all this registration money, as they call it, from all these girls, and you send them to the Gulf. I think it is one thing for us to ratify international and local agreements or regional agreements. It is quite another for us to have the will to enforce them. So, as a good example, what you were mentioning earlier in the discussion with Halai, if you look at the Migration for Employment Convention, this was ratified in 1949. We were not even a nation at the time. It was ratified on our behalf by the British. If you look at the Migrant Workers Supplementary Convention that you mentioned, number 143, this dates from 1975. We have signed it. They have signed it. Everyone is ignoring it. I think from the Kenyan side, what should happen is that the agents should be brought under the purview, if you want, of the Ministry of Labor or some other body that reports to the Ministry of Labor. Embassies in Kenya, foreign embassies in Kenya that recruit workers there should not be allowed to issue visas to anyone going to their countries unless this person has been presented by a ratified, certified, licensed agency. This is the only way to maintain that chain, that chain of responsibility for a person that's going to a country where they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the language, and they're going to an employer they've never met. Because then, if something happens on the other side, this agent can be held responsible and there can be commercial, legal, and other ramifications for them. Until this is done, so long as we have these rogue agents who can just wake up one day and get girls and traffic them to the Middle East, it's going to be very difficult for us to address the issues that they face when they get there because there's no responsibility on the supply side. And so, yeah, I do agree we need to have a regime that licenses these agents and make sure that they operate within the law. And this will in turn incentivize them to ensure, A, they select good employers, and B, they follow up on those girls that they send abroad so we can see what's happening to them and we can ensure that we protect their welfare.
No, thank you very much for that. I now hand over to my colleague.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists, for the great engagement and participants for your questions. I know that some of the panelists are responding to the questions online, but in the interest of our other participants on YouTube and Twitter, I'd just like to post the questions to you from the participants and see your response. Linda is asking Claire, thank you very much for your insights. I wonder if you're aware whether the government consulted with migrants in the GCC on their return, reintegration, and readmission, and how a structured program can be developed. Maybe you can respond to that, Claire.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for that question. I don't know that has happened. And I know the women that I know and was working with who returned to Kenya from Lebanon anyway, would really welcome an opportunity to be able to speak with the government and talk about their experiences. And one of the things that they do want to do is enter into these kind of discussions on what can be done to make sure that women aren't put in this position again. But something that we really struggled with, because we were these are people that kind of came to us. It wasn't a funded project that we had. So we were providing pro bono legal assistance, but we didn't have any money for it. And the women were incredibly poor. They were working for like $150 a month, and then they didn't get their salary. And they were eventually, some people scrounged up air flights for them to get home, and they arrived home with absolutely nothing. And so we really wanted these women to be kind of involved in advocacy and mobilization and being able to talk to government and other actors about their experiences and what needs to be done moving forward. But they couldn't, because they didn't have enough money to travel. They couldn't meet up. You need just a little bit of funding to mobilize. And as I said, for us, it wasn't a project, and them as women, they were in this horrible situation where they were basically too poor to be doing anything other than looking for a job and thinking about how to feed their families. So unfortunately, we haven't done the mobilization that we wanted to, and it's something that I think a lot of women would be really interested in if they had a little bit of support.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there's another question which I'd like to pose to either Peter or Halai. It's in relation to a report that was released yesterday by Reuters, which shows that 89 Kenyans died in the period between 2019 and 2021. And if there's anything that the ambassador's office has been doing, or if the families are ever compensated. Peter.
So from my experience in the Middle East, There was no compensation from the embassy. Depending on the case and how high profile it was, sometimes it was possible to put pressure on the Saudi government or on the other governments in the GCC, and usually they'd sponsor, for example, the transfer of the body and some money for the family. However, as a matter of policy, that did not exist at the time. I'm not sure if anything of the sort exists today, but as far as I can tell, no.
Okay, and lastly, Peter, there's somebody who also want to know from you, according to the Kenya Diaspora Policy 2014, does Kenya have a National Diaspora Council as mentioned in the policy? And if yes, what are their terms of reference?
Yeah, if you look at the the Diaspora Policy of 2014, which was implemented in 2015, the National Diaspora Council was supposed to be set up in 2021, which is this year. It has not yet been set up. It hasn't been operationalized, so effectively it does not exist. That is the reason why you've got organizations like the Kenya Diaspora Association that I'm a member of. That's why you've got associations like the Kenyan Society in Saudi Arabia. They have sprung up from the efforts of Kenyans to fill the gap that the National Diaspora Council is supposed to put together. I should mention that Dr. Shemo Chozo in particular has been very, very vocal and very active and very supportive in setting up these organizations around the world in various countries. And if you look at almost all diaspora efforts in these various countries and look at where they came from, they spring from the efforts of people like Dr. Chozo. And so at the national level, from a government perspective, no, that has not been done yet. Maybe it'll happen by the end of the year, but we are, what, 29 days away? As far as I can tell, that's not been enacted. So yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, thank you very much. And lastly, to Claire, can you elaborate at what point does the International Organization of Migrants get involved in the migrant rights violation, if at all it does?
So, I mean, the IOM does a lot of, it's just basically like a big NGO. So it does a lot of advocacy when it had people that deployed here after COVID blast, economic crisis, everything. And they did a lot of really good work I just posted an article on the chat. They published an article about it. They brought it to a lot of people's attention. They do lobbying. They also do direct assistance to migrant workers, but they can't, I mean, they're not the government of a country, so they can't ensure accountability. They're not a legal institution, so they don't take cases. They're not they're not the immigration arm of a country, so that they can't ensure that people are able to fly home. So they basically do a lot of advocacy, and the IOM have definitely been doing that here. But at some point, you need the country to step in and do the work, and that's the piece that was missing.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. And I will just take us back to Mr. Peter Onyonyi. Now that there was a question posed on whether there's the National Council on Diaspora, the National Council, Diaspora Council has been established. The policy acknowledges that for successful implementation of what it intends to do, and that is to mainstream the Kenyan diaspora into the Kenyan development process, there needs to be relevant government agencies, ministries and agencies that are involved, as well as diaspora associations and civil societies, which are critical towards the realization of the intended objective of the policy. But it's unfortunate that you have mentioned the National Council, which is mandated according to the policy to coordinate all this, has not been established yet. So we have seen the Kenya Diaspora Alliance taking leadership and conducting various conferences to bring the Kenyan diaspora to meet and understand how they can invest in Kenya, how they can remit their monies in Kenya for purposes of economic growth. And I'm aware that there is an homecoming convention that is set up for 8th and 10th of December this year. And the theme of that is the diaspora remittances as drivers of economic transformation. So if you look at this, the theme is basically on how to improve the economic growth of the country, and less is spoken about the human rights issues of Kenyans in diaspora. I would like to pose this question to you, and maybe Halai to also add something about this question. The role of the Kenya Diaspora Alliance, now that the National Council of Diaspora Association has not been established yet, what is the role of the Kenya Diaspora Alliance in promotion of the rights of women migrant workers in the diaspora? I think I should say that in the Gulf Cooperation. What is the role of these associations? Because they have been mentioned and they have been critical parties who have contributed towards the development of the diaspora policy.
Yeah. So how the local Kenyan Diaspora Association functions as far as promoting the rights of Kenyans in whatever country they are in depends a lot on the local legal and social structure. In countries where there is broad respect for the rule of law, for example, the US, you'll find that those diaspora associations are quite powerful. They're very helpful, and that's because the legal system is open and it's accessible to most people. And so you can see how to access legal services, how to access human rights services, how to access other things like healthcare and so on and so forth. In countries that are not so legally open, for example, the Middle East, that is a bit more difficult. And the reason for that is that this association is effectively informal in such a country. It is not a formal recognized one. And so even though the officials might go, for example, to the embassy, if the embassy decides not to engage the authorities on that basis, it becomes really difficult for the association to access those sort of rungs of the ladder of justice because it is not a recognized party. So I'll give you an example. The KSSA in Saudi Arabia does a lot of work completely informally. This work involves, some of it is stuff I can't really talk about, but it generally involves cases where people are being mistreated and have to be extracted from where they are and taken to the embassy and given temporary traveling papers and then brought back to Kenya. That does happen. But because of the nature of that sort of work, it is essentially informal. It cannot be formal because it doesn't quite operate within the law, so to speak. So a lot depends on the country where you are and how engaged the local Kenyan embassy is, or even if you have an embassy in the first place. And those are some of the determining factors.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Halai, since you seem to have very close ties with the embassy and the leadership of the embassy of Saudi Arabia, perhaps you can mention something about the role of the Kenya Diaspora Association.
I agree with what Peter has said. However, I would like to add that these associations become very powerful once the embassy acknowledges them. So it is in their interest to make sure that they are registered with the embassy. That way, they have the backing of the Kenyan government in everything that they attempt to try and do, okay? In cases of maybe death and the trying to collect money and make funeral arrangements to send the body back to Kenya. These associations are very useful for such things. However, it is imperative that the embassy recognizes who they are, who their leaders are, who their members are. That way, it streamlines everything.
Now that you have mentioned that there is need for recognition by the embassies of these associations, perhaps also the government through the embassies will be able to recognize these associations. Are there structures that have been put in place or mechanisms for registration of these associations? And under what policy framework or law are these associations registered?
I'm not very conversant with the process. However, whichever country we're looking at, whether it's a Gulf, wherever it is, the first thing is to go to the embassy, and that particular embassy has their own structure in place, okay? And I will still go back to my initial statement. What is happening here today, I'm not at liberty to discuss, but every embassy has its own policies, please.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that question. Now, I will move to, maybe I can hear from Claire, maybe the different approaches that have been adopted in the various jurisdictions on how, are there associations or is the embassies that take charge and are able to cater for the needs of their citizens in the diaspora?
I think that it's really common to have a combination, because associations will often, so, you know, embassies perform a really diplomatic role where they are the government and they do governmenty things like ensure that people are able to enter and leave and take care of things from the documentation side, whereas associations are more people-based, and so they're able to they can push the government on some of the policy sides of things, but also you'll often see that associations will do like cultural sharing events and you know, community building things. So I think ideally, you, in order to have kind of like a healthy functioning diaspora community, you want the governmental aspect, and then the kind of like social human aspect as well, which hopefully plays a role not just in making a community of people in the diaspora, but also pushing the government when it is not kind of living up to expectations.
Mr. Peter Wanyonyi and Halai, as members of Kenya Diaspora, do you think the Kenya Diaspora Alliance is up to task to question maybe or flag out certain concerns of Kenyan migrant workers beyond the economic outlook? Because I know emphasis has been on remittances. I have seen various conferences that are touching on issues of remittances, which ideally focus on what the foreign policy as well as the diaspora policy are addressing and focusing on economic development. But there is the social human aspect that has been mentioned by Claire that needs to be pointed out and flag out certain issues that are not done properly, so that we can, especially in the context of human rights standards, adopting a human rights approach in how we are engaging the diaspora. I think that should be the whole idea behind the social human aspect of looking at issues. So is this something the Kenya Diaspora Alliance is alive to and is working on? Because we have seen a lot is more on economic, the economic outlook of the country, and it's all about the country, and less is spoken about the challenges or the experiences or the concerns that these Kenyans in the diaspora, and specifically women migrant workers, go through in search of these remittances that we are looking for.
Yeah, I think KDA can and has been doing that. So a good example that I can show is obviously this particular webinar. It's KDA that brought us together to participate in this, and this is one of those forums where you can discuss issues to do with human rights. I believe there's potential to do more than just remittances and the occasional meeting about human rights. I think that one of the issues that KDA faces is that the issues that have to do with human rights tend to be quite sensitive to host governments. And so sometimes raising them in an unofficial capacity can be quite, it's a daunting task, obviously, because the people that are officials of KDA are also migrant workers in those countries. And as you have seen, you might have seen the case of the gentleman from Kenya last year in Qatar, who sort of raised the concerns of Kenyans in Qatar and how they're being treated. And what happened to him? He got false charges, then he was deported. And so there's always that concern that unless, as Halai said, the embassy is backing this particular association and recognizes it, unless the host government know that this is a semi-official, if you want, arm of the embassy, that the local authorities, wherever you are going to treat you a bit roughly. Now, one of the things that you mentioned as well is that there's a lot of focus on remittances. And that is true because, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the Kenyans who go abroad, I'd say the vast majority really, are going there for economic reasons. And so there's a lot of focus on what they're sending back. But obviously, not everyone gets there and has a pleasant experience. And so I think it probably means that the associations abroad and the government back home in Kenya need to work together so that it's a coin of two faces. There will be the money side of things, but even as that money comes in and that cash cow is sending in that money, we should make sure that it's watered, it is fed, and it's taken care of wherever it is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Just a follow-up question. this issue of migration is really a tricky issue because we see every day in the Gulf, in Libya, in Malta, in Italy, African migrants are subsidizing imports. So we still expect people to travel, to migrate, that is expected. But how would you advise these young Kenyan women in terms of how to know a ratified agency or how to get to know which agencies to work with? Because some of these agencies are still the same ones that work with the violators. Thank you.
The Ministry of Labor does maintain a register of what it recognizes as official agencies. So they exist. And these official agencies of the Ministry of Labor are connected to the embassies. However, Kenya being Kenya, and you and I know what I'm talking about.
We have lost you a bit.
Sorry,
we lost you a bit. You can maybe.
Yeah, and I was just saying that the ministry, can you hear me?
Yes,
you can hear now.
Sorry, I was just saying the Ministry of Labor in Nairobi does maintain a list of official agencies which are recognized by the embassies. The problem is that there's no enforcement as far as the issuance of visas is concerned. So the embassies will issue visas to pretty much anyone. Now the ministry might have its own list, but if you go to somebody somewhere on whatever street in Nairobi and they convince you to go to the Gulf and they find you an employer and they help you get a visa, you will go. That doesn't mean that the embassy of Saudi Arabia is going to decline to issue the visa. So I think what needs to happen really is that the ministry has to have a chat with the embassy and say, we don't want you to issue visas unless these people are coming to you from this list of agents. If we can do that, then we'll be okay. So there is a list. If someone wants to find the list, obviously the usual advisories apply. We're not really providing this advice in a professional capacity, but the ministry does have a list of official agencies.
Thank you.
Now, to wrap up the discussion before we get to what your final recommendations would be on this topic and how we move forward towards protection of the rights of women migrant workers, perhaps it's just to speak on the question of the economic angle towards migrant workers. Now, we had a look at the central bank survey on the remittances that were received last year and this year. And so far from the Gulf, it was 1.5 billion Kenya shillings. That was remitted last year, and that contributes a lot to the economic growth. Just this year, between January and August, there were remittances to the tune of 1.025 billion Kenya shillings. So there is a lot that goes towards developing the economic growth of the country, the GDP, and so forth. Now, I would like, in the context of this discussion, for one of you, I don't know whether it is Halai, because you're a live migrant worker who is working in Saudi Arabia, and I don't know whether you do remittances to Kenya. Peter, Wanyonyi, the same, whether remittances come to Kenya, so that you can speak on this, whether there is a correlation between safeguarding just the human rights aspect of migrant workers, as well as productivity, and which as a result guarantees economic growth of the country. Is there a correlation?
Shall I go?
Okay. I believe there is. How do I address this? So the reason that people are leaving the country to come here is to make a better living for themselves, okay? Every person, every worker that is in this country, for example, is supporting at least 10 businesses back home. What do I mean by that? Someone has bought land and is building something. So they are employing some manual laborers to build that house. That person, the same person here, has a child and is educating that child in a school back in Kenya. So they're paying school fees to a private school, basically building up somebody's business there. okay? Because the lady that is working here has left the child there, she's employing a house girl back home, okay? So she's helping someone else. Every single person here is creating business back home, okay? And therefore, driving the economic system, you know, of the country back home. So it is in everyone's interest to make sure that the person here is safe, is able to continue working for as long as possible. Okay, I hope that makes sense.
That was brilliant, very simple, straight to the point. Even Virginia here was able to understand that. And I like the way you have related it to the realities that somebody has gone outside to get employment opportunity and is looking back at where they came from, the country of origin, and they're either constructing a house or they're helping their child go to school. And that is what Virginia said, that her dependent or somebody she's depending on left the country for greener pastures so that she could support both the family and the child who is going to school. So it's a very classic example of the correlation between safeguarding human rights, because you have spoken about the aspect of there's need for there to be a safe, enabling working environment for migrant workers who or Kenyans in diaspora to be able to flourish, be productive, and as a result, enhance the economic growth of this country. I don't know whether, Peter, you want to add something? Yes, I'll give you that opportunity. Then we move to the next stage, which is your final comments, and maybe we hear from Virginia on what her recommendations are. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just very quickly. The story that Virginia shared is a very familiar one. If you work or live in the Middle East, and the chain of misfortunes that she related literally it replicates itself across the experiences of pretty much every girl that goes to the Middle East and comes back with a sad story to tell. And so not to add much to what Halai said, she summarizes pretty well. So yeah, if we can take care of that aspect of things, it is okay for us to get that remittance portion of the cake coming home, but we also have a duty of care as Kenya and as the Kenyan government to look after those people wherever they are abroad. So yeah.
Now that we have established there's a correlation, do you think that the policies we have, both the foreign policy and the diaspora policy, address these three critical issues that are correlated, that need to enhance the economic growth of the country, because the focus of the policy seems to be on economic growth and national development?
Yeah, I don't think they explicitly address it, because I think the focus that that Kenya looks at essentially is how much is coming in terms of dollars, and therefore how much the forex position of the country improves. I think if we were to look at actually enhancing economic growth, we'll be looking at two things. First, people are sending money home. What does it do when it gets home? It gets used up in normal day-to-day activities. So that money is not really being productive for the person that's abroad. Now, I'll give you an example. If you have time, pop into the Philippine embassy in Kenya. There's lots of Filipinos working in Kenya. You'll find that there's a dedicated investment desk at the Philippine embassy. It's the same thing in Saudi Arabia. And what they do is they have these schemes that come from their commercial agencies back home, and they sell them to the people working in that host country. And so even though you're sending home, say 30% of your income, you can save some and invest in something back home, so that after 2 years of working in the Gulf, when you go back home, you've made enough money and enough saving, so you don't have to go back. But the familiar story that you hear is that someone sends money back home for 3 or 4 years, they come back home, they haven't got anything, and so they're forced to go back to the Middle East. And because they know they haven't got anything, they persevere whatever abuse they're given, because if they go home, what is their child going to eat? And so this is something that we need to do.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a last question to Claire here from the BBC. And even KJ might be able to respond to this. And they're asking if there are any statistics of harassment of women migrant workers, especially sexual harassment.
Oh, we can't hear you, Claire. I think you've muted.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. My bad. There's not a body that's systematically collecting those statistics because there's kind of a dearth of anybody operating in this area. The entity that should collect statistics about what happens to diaspora is, again, the consul or the embassy, and they're not doing it. So the people that are doing it are like NGOs that come in. So we have some numbers. I know that IOM also does have some numbers. There's another organization that was working here that has collected some accounts of abuse, but it's not all deep. It's not all neatly in like an official record somewhere. It's just different NGOs, anti-racism movement as well. So different NGOs have different allegations that have kind of been filed with them or that they've done reports on. But yeah, there's not an official record of it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, just to wrap up this discussion, I would like to begin with Halai, maybe your recommendations or your last comments on the issue of the plight of women migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, and perhaps some recommendations to the government on how to improve on the services that they offer to women migrant workers.
I think I mentioned everything right at the beginning of my presentation. I said 6 things that I believe the government should be able to do. One thing that no one has really addressed is the workers themselves.
Sorry?
One thing that no one has really addressed right now is the workers themselves. Okay, so I would like to just say one thing about the workers that are getting ready or have intentions of coming this way to work. There's a huge disconnect between their expectations and the reality on the ground. Riyadh, the city of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, has been ranked, I think, number 3 over the last 3 months as number 3 in the smartest cities in the world. That means that it is now a smart community. All the houses are smart. So when a girl comes from upcountry, goes to the airport for the first time, gets onto a plane and arrives here, she goes to her employer. The first day she is given a tablet and told, go and wash clothes. She has no understanding that this tablet is connected to the washing machine. It is Wi-Fi operated, you know. She has no understanding that she can control the lights through the tablet, everything. All the appliances are smart. The number of smart homes right now in this city is quite high. So they need to go through some training. They need to also get in touch with people who are here so that they can understand that what they think they know, they really don't know. Okay, once they arrive here and face such a situation, that's when the friction arises, because the employer has expectations. The girl does not understand what these expectations are. So there needs to be something to bridge that gap so that we can reduce the friction. Okay.
Perhaps before we move to the next recommendation, I would want you to define the term smart. You have said, for example, Riyadh is a smart community. What do you mean by smart? Because from the African context, even in the village where I come from, or Virginia comes from, she believes that is smart. The 3-stoned meko that she uses to cook and the firewood, for her, she sees that as smart. Yeah, so, and she's saying exactly, she's here. So she wants to understand this concept of smart and what smart is.
I think I would like Peter to explain that.
Yeah, what you mean by a smart city is a city whose public services and household services are generally offered via devices connected to some form of network or internet. So smartness in terms of technology not necessarily in terms of arrangement or it's clean or something. Just, yeah, in the same way you say a smartphone, you don't necessarily mean that it's clean. It means that it has certain functionalities based on technology. That is what she means by a smart city.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you for that explanation, because our survivor here was wondering, what is this smart? I'm not getting it. Thank you very much for that. Your second recommendation, but that, on a lighter note, it has made us smile in this very serious discussion. Thank you very much. Hala, you can proceed. Alai, we are waiting for you, or we can move to Peter as you try and gather yourself.
Yeah, sure, certainly. By way of recommendations, I've got one or two, but the first one is really a question of what our national strategy is as far as providing labor is concerned. Do we want to be a country that provides housemaids or semi-skilled or unskilled labor to world markets? I don't think Kenya has made its mind up on that. I live in New Zealand, and there's quite a number of Kenyans who come here, and what they come here to do essentially is to work on farms, to do milking and this sort of thing. But this is a different market compared to the Middle East when I lived there, and so the opportunities here for advancement. There are no opportunities in the Middle East for an unskilled laborer to rise up and become a semi-skilled or skilled person. What you go in as typically is what you come out as at the end of the contract. To address abuse of girls who are sent to the Middle East, as I said earlier, we must have a regime that licenses agents, and this must be policed quite stringently. Once you have that in place, I believe that we should have a system where those who are allowed to recruit girls to send to the Middle East have to pay a bond to the government. Now, for example, an approved agency can pay a bond, I don't know, $20,000. How much is a human life worth? Give them $20,000, give them $1 million shillings or something. This money is held for that girl in an account, and the agent has no access to it until the girl returns safely. On top of that, they should have a registration fee every year so that we can register some and we can deregister others. If you do that and there are financial penalties for these agencies, and there are real legal terms in jail if they don't stick to the terms of their requirements legally, then you'll start to see behavior starting to change, because then they start taking responsibility for the people they recruit to send to the Middle East. I think that is critical, and we need to have something like that in place. To go back to what Halai was saying about the way Riyadh is, a lot of our people go to the Middle East unprepared. They don't really understand how the culture is. They don't understand the language, apart from quite a few, just a few of them. And they're not really ready for the sort of work that we get there and they're forced to do, or they're made to do. So I think before people sign up and they buy visas and they get passports and they go, there should be some sort of even if it's just a 2-day training, explaining to them what a day working as a domestic laborer in Saudi Arabia is like, and then see whether they'd like to do that or not. But at least when they land there, they will know they'll know what to expect when they get there. But most importantly, I think the burden of really fixing this issue has to go back to our people and our government and our politicians. The reason why we're sending unskilled people to the Middle East is because the economic situation back home is terrible. And until we begin addressing these things, so a good example is what the lady talked about. This young lady had a child. She's supporting this child alone. She's gone to the Middle East because she's got no other option. There are simple things we can do to make this easier. You know, why aren't we giving aid to mothers like her? We can afford all these big Mercedes Benzes for people, the president, ministers, everybody getting millions in salaries. Why can't we have a simple welfare aid package for people that find themselves without a job and she's had a baby, especially ladies? Why can't we help them? What is the problem? How is that so difficult? These are the things we need to do. They're really simple things. They're really basic things, but until we begin looking at ourselves in the mirror, we'll never really get around a grip on this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Your final thoughts, Claire, before we move to Virginia?
Just really quickly, I think the Kenyan government needs to do a couple of things on the regulatory side and a couple of things on just the side of taking action to ensure accountability. Adopting the diaspora policy sounds like a really good idea, as does ratifying the remaining ILO conventions on the rights of migrant domestic workers. And I think it urgently needs to be investigating allegations of abuse made against various consuls and acting to discipline them or remove them if those allegations are found to be justified.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we'll go back to our survivor or somebody who's had an experience with her member being outside Kenya in Saudi Arabia, maybe to give us her final thoughts. Virginia, tungependa utueleze ni haswa nini ungependa ifanyike kuhusu masuala ama dhuluma ambayo mwenzako amekumbwa nayo, maybe ni serikali ama ni wewe.
Okay, well, thank you. Me, I would like the government to give hand in helping those migrant workers so that they may be able to get their survivors, and as well as they get back and they continue with their good living. So I would urge the government to give hand in supporting the migrant workers and support the society that do push the relationship between those workers and the government and the employers, so that they may proceed well in their living. Also, I would like the government to assist those migrant workers, those who have been stuck over there in Gulf countries, so that their well-being may be looked up on, so that they may also feel that they are our own children, our own members, and enjoy, and also come back into our country and enjoy their living. Also, once they are there, so because there are others who say that once they are working there, things are going well, they do feel they are comfortable once they are there. So I would ask the government to make up policies, good policies that do unite the governing of those good policies for things to go well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Asante sana, Virginia. As we wind up, thank you. I think you've had recommendations from both a victim as well as the panelists who have been gracious enough to host, to participate in this webinar. We have come to the end or the closure of this webinar, and we want to thank our panelists who have taken the time to actually give their views about the topic that we had today, which was the Kenyan Diaspora Policy, safeguarding human rights standards for the protection of women migrant workers. The discussions have been very critical. We have heard from both the embassy's perspective through Halai. We have also had critical analysis of various issues from Peter as well as Claire, and we want to thank them for this, just taking the time to be with us. We would like to announce that tomorrow, this is a series of webinars. We have tomorrow another one that speaks on the right of migrant workers, perspectives from the migrant workers themselves. We'll have the opportunity to hear from the various migrant workers who have gone through various, have had various experiences and challenges when they were at the Gulf. We will also have panelists who will critically analyze their rights in the context of the various international, regional, and national legislation and policy framework to be able to inform them of what options are available in terms of seeking redress. Thank you very much for joining us. I now hand over to my colleague, Moses Okinyi.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And thank you very much, our panelists, Halai Timase, Peter Wanyonyi from KEPA, and Claire Brown from Victim Advocates International. Asanteni sana, kwa Kiswahili tunasema hivyo. And I would also like to appreciate our participants. Thank you so much. I know we had some challenges logging in, but that will be rectified. So I'm sure for the webinar tomorrow, we'll have very easy in terms of register, in terms of joining. So on behalf of our board chair, Nancy Kinu, I just like to say thank you all. on behalf of our Executive Director, Anne Ireri, I'd like to say thank you. I'd also like to appreciate our technical team here at our FIDA Kenya studio. Thank you very much, the technical team. And just to assure that the conversation continues, and as FIDA Kenya, we promise to, with the involvement of our partners like Victims Advocates International, KD, and others, we promise to continue the fight to promote the rights of Kenyan women, no matter where they are. We will work to ensure that we promote their rights. So the fight continues. The conversation continues. If you follow our social media channels, you'll find a lot of messaging there. So you are most invited to follow and like us. Otherwise, asanteni sana, and God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.